evening. Welcome to the show. I'm Sharri. Anthony Albanese all but collapses at the finish line as Parliament breaks for the year. His popularity has never been lower after the failed referendum, rising cost of living and increasing pressure from the opposition over the debacle that today saw a fifth former detainee arrested. Will 2024 be any better? Bronwyn Bishop and Jason Morrison will join me later. Plus, more evidence revealed in the Bruce Lehrmann trial as former political staffers and security guards testify. Carolyn Marcus will join me from the court with the latest. An Israeli soldier who saw firsthand the atrocities committed by Hamas. He personally killed 30 of the terrorists as they tried to invade a kibbutz. He'll join me live in studio. His incredible story in a moment. And Alan Jones has initiated legal action for defamation against the Sydney Morning Herald after they accused him of indecently assaulting multiple young men. He denies all the allegations. But first tonight, I want to start by asking this question. Where are all the feminists? Whether it's the silence over the Attorney General's sexist treatment of a female journalist or the absence of any concern over the gang rape of Jewish women by Hamas, the feminists have been missing in action. The first case in point is the sexist way that the Attorney General Mark Dreyfus scolded political reporter Olivia Caisley yesterday.
And I will not be apologising for acting. Do not interrupt. I will not be apologising for acting. I will not be apologising for acting in accordance with a High Court decision. Your question is an absurd one.
The Attorney General lectured her, told her not to interrupt, pointed his finger, wagged his finger at her. Very patronising. It was a legitimate question, and the way he spoke to her was out of line. Two male press gallery journalists, James Massola of the Sydney Morning Herald and James Morrow of the Telegraph, made the point on Twitter that had a coalition figure spoken to a female journalist like this, there'd be a riot or claims of misogyny. But those were two male press gallery journalists. What have the veteran press gallery journalists, the women who were so concerned about the Me Too movement in Canberra and the treatment of women under Scott Morrison, well, what have they said? Nothing. Or even worse, they've defended Mark Dreyfus. The Guardian's Catherine Murphy was very critical of the Liberal Party's treatment of women.
Prime Minister, two things. There'll be women listening on to your comments this morning, wondering why it took you a month to get to their lived reality that they started with on the day where Brittany Higgins came forward. So can you explain why it took a month to get to this position?
And at the time, she wrote in one column, Scott Morrison's efforts to engage with women are more me than mea culpa. But then today, on Dreyfus's treatment of Olivia Caisley, Murphy wrote that his lawyerly disdain was an utterly reasonable riposte in the world where substance informs actions. She wrote, if the first law officer of the land won't defend the rule of law from encroaching populism and post-truth, then who will? She says he was right to point out responsible governments should not instruct officials to act unlawfully, particularly in the light of recent case studies. Thank God someone is prepared to make this point, she wrote. And there was no mention in her column of the sexist or patronising way Dreyfus had wagged his finger at Caisley. Nothing about how clearly sexist this was, how he would never dare wag his finger at a male press gallery journalist. The ABC's political editor Laura Tingle also criticised Scott Morrison for his so-called women's issue.
Actually, Prime Minister, the women of Australia may not forgive you this indulgence. Those women may be wondering what exactly the Prime Minister has been doing for the past month and what sick culture has been allowed to develop within the government and within Parliament House under his watch as Prime Minister.
But then just last night, she actually interviewed Mark Dreyfus and didn't even ask about his treatment of a female journalist. It was a very soft interview. Look how it started.
have obviously been played very hard in recent weeks, as reflected in that exchange this morning. But can we just ignore Peter Dutton for a moment?
And what about the so-called Labor frontbench feminists? Tanya Plibersek slammed Morrison for his treatment of women.
Because it does show that the government acknowledges that they've got a woman problem. I don't think anybody believes that some of this investment would have happened if Scott Morrison wasn't trying to fix a political problem of the government's own making because of their shocking handling in recent months of... Look, I think Australian women who marched for justice not so long ago were saying very clearly that they are angry at this government. It's no wonder that Australian women are angry at this government.
But then today, it was nothing to see here about Dreyfus.
I think people should speak calmly whenever they can. In public life and in politics, they should speak calmly. But what you saw was a heated exchange between an excellent Attorney-General and an excellent journalist.
The Minister for Women, Katie Gallagher, also criticised Morrison at the time.
Clearly, the Prime Minister has an issue with women. We know that.
Nothing today on Mark Dreyfus. And in question time, Labor Minister Catherine King thanked the Speaker for his protection after being interjected by the opposition.
The tunnel.
Order.
The tunnel.
Order.
Well, let me just tell you a little bit about the genius of this. This is important for those opposite to actually listen to.
The Minister has the call.
Thank you. I note with some irony the previous question about shouting at women when you do that, but thank you very much for the protection.
Order.
Can
Order.
I then just suggest...
Order. Members on my left.
The hypocrisy. There's no question if it was a coalition male politician that Plibersek, Katie Gallagher and the other Labor women would have been very hard in condemning them. Opposition leader Peter Dutton clearly said that this was sexist treatment of a female press gallery journalist when I interviewed him here on this program last night.
The response I thought was outrageous, and it demonstrated to me a man who's under great pressure, who knows that he's got it wrong and knows that this government has made a very serious error that's resulted in at least one Australian being sexually assaulted, and there are many others out there at the moment who have serious criminal histories, and there will be a lot of Australians worried that further offences will be committed. I don't understand where Tanya Plibersek has been, or Katie Gallagher or Penny Wong or others out there calling out this misogynistic behaviour by the Attorney-General.
Misogynistic behaviour by the Attorney-General. So is Peter Dutton now a greater defender of women than the so-called feminists? Well, in this instance, yes. In question time today, Deputy Liberal leader Susan Ley demanded answers from the Prime Minister about whether he'd asked Dreyfus to apologise.
A young female journalist asked if a woman who had been assaulted by one of those released deserved an apology. Not only did the Attorney-General refuse to apologise, he aggressively shouted at the young female journalist. Has the Prime Minister forced the Attorney-General to apologise?
The Attorney-General has, my understanding is, has spoken to the journalist concerned, has apologised.
And the Prime Minister went on to say that standards hadn't been met. So if even he can concede that standards hadn't been met, why can't the female veterans of the press gallery? Why can't the Labor frontbenchers? Why can't the feminists? And then on another issue, where have the feminists been on the brutal rape and gang rapes of Jewish women in Israel on the 7th of October? We've seen the horrific videos of how Hamas treated women during those attacks. And a warning, these videos are distressing and hard to watch. Those videos capture the barbaric treatment of young women, some just teenagers. And a new Reuters report describes how many of the 300 women who were killed by Hamas on October 7 were brought into the morgue in just their underwear. Some bodies were just a torso or were mutilated. Reuters reports 7 accounts by first responders that attest to sexual violence, and the Sunday Times in the UK has done a similar investigation. Their journalist, Christina Lamb, gave this chilling account after her reporting.
One man in particular who hid under the body of a woman that was shot and then was for hours trying to get out of there. He saw a number of girls being raped, but he told me in particular about one who was raped by about 10 Hamas fighters. And she was just begging them to kill her, actually, because it was just so horrific what they were doing. And he said that she had the face of an angel and that he wakes every night now to see that face.
Now think about this. The major marches that we saw for the Me Too movement and for Brittany Higgins, who may or may not have been raped, are missing for the Jewish women who categorically were raped. There's the eyewitness accounts and video evidence to prove it. Yet there are no marches outside Parliament House or in every capital city like there were in the wake of the Higgins allegations. It's believe all women unless you're Jewish. United Nations Women took nearly 2 months to comment on the violent rape of Israeli women, only issuing a brief sentence condemning it last week. There are high-profile women who can't even say that calls for a genocide would amount to bullying and harassment. These 3 dills, who are the head of Ivy League colleges, well, I played you their appalling comments at length last night, but here's just a quick reminder.
At MIT, does calling for the genocide of Jews violate MIT's code of conduct or rules regarding bullying and harassment? Yes or no?
If targeted at individuals, not making public statements.
Yes or no? Calling for the genocide of Jews does not constitute bullying and harassment?
I have not heard calling for the genocide for Jews on our campus.
But you've specifically calling for the genocide of Jews. Does that constitute bullying or harassment?
It is a context-dependent decision, Congresswoman.
Yes or no?
If the speech becomes conduct, it can be harassment, yes.
They'd probably consider themselves feminists and they'd turn up at high-profile boardroom lunches for corporate women in their heels, but they're not feminists. They've shown a collective lack of ethics. They've shown clear discrimination against Jews. And as American businessman Bill Ackman put it, their profound moral bankruptcy has been exposed. He said on Twitter, the president's answers reflect the profound educational, moral and ethical failures that pervade certain of our elite educational institutions, due in large part to their failed leadership. But the lack of condemnation internationally about the treatment of Israeli women has been so astonishing that senior figures in Washington, from the president down, are now commenting on it.
The fact that it seems one of the reasons they don't want to turn women over that they've been holding hostage, and the reason this pause fell apart, is they don't want those women to be able to talk about what happened to them.
It is outrageous that some who claim to stand for justice are closing their eyes and their hearts to the victims of Hamas.
When I saw the list of women's rights organizations who have said nothing, I nearly choked. Where is the solidarity for women in this country and in this world to stand up for our mothers, our sisters, and our daughters?
And we think about, rape and the use of rape as being used as a weapon. That is also reprehensible.
Our Washington correspondent, Annalise Nielsen, asked the White House National Security spokesman John Kirby whether the US would provide support for Israeli women by holding Hamas accountable for violent war crimes. She pointed out that the US had provided money to support the prosecution of war crimes and other atrocities by Russia in Ukraine. Well, here's what Kirby told Annalise Nielsen.
Honestly, I don't know of any plans to do that, to help to financially assist in the prosecutorial efforts. So we can take that question and see if we can get back to you with a better answer. I'm not aware of any efforts to do that. But you heard the president speak about this yesterday, the sexual assault and violence that had been perpetrated by Hamas on innocent women and children. It's despicable. And the Israelis, again, not only have every right and responsibility to go after Hamas leadership, but every right and responsibility to look into this and prosecute those war crimes.
Strong comments, and we will follow up with the White House whether they do intend to help prosecute the rapes and the violent war crimes by Hamas. Well, I haven't seen Foreign Minister Penny Wong or Prime Minister Anthony Albanese make any comments specifically on the violence against women by Hamas. As Gemma Tognini wrote in her column in The Australian, where are the modern-day feminists? Where are the Me Too and Believe All Women Brigade? She says, I'll offer a couple of answers to start with. They're publicly and energetically refusing to believe the first-hand accounts of Israeli women, Jewish women. At the very least, they're downplaying and diminishing, gutless in their mealy-mouthed responses to October 7, or they're silent altogether, hiding, cowardly and complicit in their refusal to speak. And Gemma writes about how the number of women and young girls defending Hamas's femicide, savagery and brutal subjugation of women as a means of resistance is astonishing. And it's true that these leftist women have turned rape into resistance, seeing it as acceptable to fight for Palestinian freedom. Instead of anger at the gang rapes, there's anger at Israel. They only stand up for the sisterhood when it suits them, when it suits their political agendas, when it's their political enemies in the frame. We've seen conclusively that women who build their brands on women's rights are now missing in action. Their claims of solidarity with women are a farce. Their claims of feminism, utterly fraudulent. All right, joining me now to have a look at the top stories of the day, Sky News host James Morrow and National Senator for Queensland Matt Canavan. Welcome to you both. Look, today was the final day for Parliament for the year. We saw that independent senators David Pocock and Jackie Lambie helped pass key components of the IR legislation for the government. The government also handed down a major review of the National Disability Insurance Scheme this morning. James, Albanese has now squared away these two tricky areas, the IR laws and the NDIS. But then there was also that admission from Albanese today that Dreyfus's conduct was unbecoming. How do you see the year ending for the Prime Minister?
Oh, look, even despite those victories on NDIS and IR, and I don't think IR is going to be a victory in the long run, I think it's very, very messy. You know, the shine is well and truly off this government, and the habits we saw at the start of the year, where Anthony Albanese had to be pried out of the Melbourne Open to go deal with Alice Springs when that was melting down, that same lack of agility and focus and attention to detail has plagued him all the way through everything that's happened here, from the referendum to the detainee crisis and everything else. So bad end to the year, and he's got a rough one coming up.
Matt Canavan, what did you think of the hypocrisy as I've just outlined it from the feminists?
Well, look, I think this is, as someone in your package mentioned, Sharri, it's the moral bankruptcy of identity politics. And in some respect, it's the bonfire of the identities here that the feminism and other isms are meant to defend the rights of certain groups, but really what they are is the continuation of politics through other means. And it's pretty clear here that for some, and only some feminists, they'll only defend women of a certain type. And I don't want to play the identity politics card in any way, shape or form. I think it's a bankrupt form of discussion and debate. I think every human being has inherent value. And when we see the kind of horrific scenes we did committed by Hamas, we should condemn them, because we should not accept what happened, what some of these people have done, these animals have done to other human beings. That should be our response. And our response should be to protect humanity right across the world, whether you're black, whether you're white, whether you're male, whether you're female. That needs to be the equality we get back to in Western societies.
Yeah. Now, James, we saw the news today that a fifth former immigration detainee has been arrested on an outstanding New South Wales warrant. The government also got its legislation through the Parliament. What are the new details of this legislation, and do we actually know how many of the 147 newly released criminals will now be back behind bars?
Well, we don't know. We don't know the numbers here, and this is a key thing that people are really wanting to know. And Andrew Giles, I think, has been very shifty on this. He's hiding behind process and saying, oh, we don't want to prejudice any of these cases. What is basically being done now is what should have been done at the start, and they should have had the legislation ready to go on this before the High Court handed down their decision. This is the real problem here, you know, that they keep saying, oh, well, this thing happens, you know, with people being released under both governments. Well, fine, but you've got to be ready for it. And this is where they failed an anxious Australian community.
Matt, this immigration scandal, do you think this has been the government's biggest own goal to date?
Oh, look, I do think so, Sharri, because it's had such real-world consequences for people. It's put at risk the security of almost all Australians, but then worse, it's actually breached that security, or seemingly breached that security, in a number of cases around the 4 individuals that have been re-arrested. I mean, in some respects, there's always going to be a debate about how much inflation is a result of government or economic growth is a result of government. There are obviously things that are determined by many different forces. But this particular example is one where the government had everything in its own control and at its own desk, and the buck stops with them. They were clearly not prepared for the High Court loss. They've had multiple shifting stories and responses to that loss in the space of weeks, and they've completely lost control of a basic part of government administration here. So it is totally incompetent. The Prime Minister seems completely absent, not just physically when he's overseas, but mentally he doesn't seem to be in charge at the moment, doesn't seem to have authority over his own ministers or governments, and that's got to concern all Australians.
Yeah, maybe the wind's out of his sails after that Voice defeat.
I think so.
James, very quickly, the Republican candidates faced off in their final debate. Who do you think were the strongest performers and who is now finished?
Look, I think, Chris Christie is absolutely done for. I think there's some wind behind Nikki Haley, but it's all very corporate establishment money that's not going to get her anywhere in the long run. DeSantis did very well, and I think because some of the pressure of Trump is now off him, that's all focused on Biden. He's freer to be Ron. And Vivek was interesting. He went for a lot of sort of Twitter troll lines, you know, attacking Nikki Haley. But there's some interesting stuff there where he also was trying to get some bigger ideas out into the forum. So I think the biggest winner is probably DeSantis. Our biggest loser, Chris Christie.
Matt, we've seen comedian Russell Brand. He's been cancelled, but he took to his YouTube channel to promote our new Wuhan documentary. He expressed his shock at the fact that our revelation that scientists deliberately downplayed suggestions that the virus had leaked from a lab. Have a quick look.
If you'd said that those agencies were involved in the funding of Wuhan and that it was likely that the virus had emerged from the laboratory in early 2020 or midway through 2020, you would have been kicked off the internet. You might even have been dragged out of your home.
Unfortunately, Shervo, there's been no international inquiry. It shouldn't be left up to journalists to investigate this.
Perhaps this is all a terrible mishap and the Wuhan Institute of Virology just suddenly became a little bit slapdash and it was an error. No, apparently there had been concerns about safety in the Wuhan Institute of Virology for some time that was well reported and well understood extraordinarily.
Matt, he raises the point that there are no COVID inquiries that are actually examining the origins of the pandemic.
Well, that's right, Sharri, and the biggest issue here is we all know what Russell just said now, but the biggest issue is that the people that cancelled people, that perpetuated these myths have not been held responsible, and we are at risk of making the same mistakes again. We haven't learnt our lessons, I don't think, and in the new year I'll be bringing legislation to the Parliament to have a proper independent COVID inquiry here in Australia, something the Prime Minister has not given to the Australian people.
Well, it's so important because his COVID inquiry, as we know, failed to live up to expectations and won't be examining the states. Matt Canavan, James Morrow, thank you both so much. Coming up, an Israeli soldier who saw firsthand the atrocities committed by Hamas will join me live in studio. Welcome back. Well, Israeli Major Officer Nimrod Palmach was in Israel on October 7, and instead of running away from the terror, he went towards it. He's here in Australia and joins me now to talk about what happened on that day. Nimrod, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
So take us back to October 7. You were directed to go to Jerusalem, but you didn't do that. What happened?
So basically, I realized something really bad is happening. I watched different videos and understanding the situation in the south is getting bad. I also got a phone call from my ex-wife and her boyfriend. He lives in one of the kibbutzim in Iroz, telling me there is terrorists literally outside his safe room door. At that moment, I realized I have to defy an order and drive south in order to save life, and as fast as I can, by the way.
And what happened?
I got, right before I got to the highway of the Gaza envelope, I stopped aside to say goodbye to my kids. I realized I'm about to die. I actually,
wow.
I realized.
Say goodbye to your children.
So I took a picture of myself on video. They were still asleep. It was really early in the morning. And I did a selfie, and I had 20 seconds to say goodbye to my kids, which was one of the hardest things I had to do. And from that moment on, I put my phone in my pocket, and I decided I'm going into battle. And I have one mission, is to save life. I'm understanding that Hamas has already controlled the kibbutzim, controlled the highways. They are everywhere, and it's going to be a long day. And I just went ahead.
So you came across a group of 30 Hamas terrorists. Tell us what happened then.
So it was right outside Kibbutz Alumim, and they were actually planning to go into the kibbutz, to invade the kibbutz, and to do another massacre, like they did in Kibbutz Be'eri. So the moment we got there, they fired on our vehicle. It was an ambush, and I jumped, I saw the car, and immediately I've seen a half-naked woman laying on the ground. She was half burned, and it looked really bad, and a dead soldier. I took his weapon, I armed, and I engaged fight. During this fight, I'm behind a car, shooting at a terrorist, and suddenly I feel something in my leg, something soft that prevent me to shoot right. I look down and I see a naked woman laying on her stomach. And you have to understand, this is a highway. It's not and I'm realizing there is a Holocaust around me. I stop shooting at the terrorist, and I look inside the car and I see 2 young babies dead, shot dead.
Oh my God.
This is probably their mother. And then I look all over sides and I see more and more of these views, and it was horrible. Eventually, we managed to end this fight on our side and prevent these terrorists to go inside the kibbutz and killing more and raping more people.
So end this fight. You managed to defeat that group of 30 Hamas terrorists.
Yeah, I was with a group of soldiers with me. Listen, when you fight for life and for values like human rights, love, empathy, and the other side fights for cherishing death and destruction, it's an obvious win. We won. Our fight and our cause were much better. And eventually we finished that fight and we went on to Kibbutz Be'eri in order to liberate the kibbutz, because the kibbutz was already taken by Hamas terrorists. And I have to tell you, the terrorists in Be'eri really took their time. It was not just killing Jews. They took their time, they mutilated, they did horrible things for women, kids, full families. This is something I've never thought I'd live to see.
So what's your reaction when we see women's and children's groups internationally fail to come out and condemn what happened?
This is a moral issue. And I think it makes me think really deep questions in life and about people and leaders. And it's a question about leadership and your moral fiber. Not be able to criticize and to stand against this kind of evilness. This is simply misunderstanding of the problem. This is not Hamas against Israel. This is a jihad war against us, against Western civilization. And that's what needs to be told.
Yeah. Now, everyone will be wondering why you're here in Sydney, Australia.
I have a few weeks vacation from the army, and I decided I need to fight for Israel's right to better life, to life. So I decided to go travel in different countries, and I'm meeting parliament members, media outlets, and talk to Jewish communities in order to leave an impact and to expose Hamas crimes.
So it's a stress leave from the army. They've said to you take a couple of weeks off as a break.
It's for everyone, meaning that the army gets it, that this war against evilness will take time. So we are doing reliefs, and on my time, I decided instead of just rest or whatever, come here and to talk to the Jewish community.
The message is so important. Nimrod, thank you very much for joining us. And I just want to point out to all our viewers that when you protected that first kibbutz, you saved 500 lives. That's the biggest mitzvah anyone could ever do. So huge thank you.
Thank you very much.
And after the break, we will cross to Caroline Marcus, who's at the court. She has the latest on the Bruce Lehrmann, Brittany Higgins case. Stay tuned. Here are the top 5 stories you need to know tonight. Partially redacted details of the $2.3 million Brittany Higgins payout will be made public after they were admitted into evidence today. Labor struck a deal with the crossbench to pass parts of its IR reforms on the final sitting day of Parliament for the year. Preventative detention legislation has been passed by Parliament after a fiery late-night session. Taylor Swift is named Time magazine's Person of the Year, beating out others on the shortlist, including Vladimir Putin, King Charles and Barbie. And veteran broadcaster Alan Jones is taking legal action against the Sydney Morning Herald for defamation over allegations he indecently assaulted multiple young men. He denies the allegations. They were discussed on Ray Hadley's 2GB show this morning, where Ray spoke with one of the alleged victims.
The behaviour he was alleging was unwanted sexual advances from a person in a position of power, that being his boss, Alan Jones. My relationship with Alan Jones goes back over 30 years. But from the day I spoke to Bradley, our relationship was basically severed.
Alan Jones's defamation lawyer, Mike O'Brien, said in a statement, "Our client denies ever having indecently assaulted the persons referred to in your letter, and your suggestion that he has is scandalous, grossly offensive and seriously defamatory of him." Let's cross now to our senior reporter, Caroline Marcus. Caroline, you've got some breaking news. The Commonwealth payout for Brittany Higgins was a higher amount than what the court had previously disclosed. Tell us what's happened.
That's right, Sharri. The court has just a few moments ago published that deed of settlement, the payout that Brittany Higgins received from the Commonwealth government following her allegations that she was raped by Bruce Lehrmann. Now, in court earlier this week, Brittany Higgins had told the court that she had received a payout somewhere around $2.3 million before tax and before some legal costs were taken out. What the deed of settlement actually reveals is that that figure was actually $2.45 million that she received from the Commonwealth, so a significantly higher amount than what she had told the court. It also breaks down what the payout was for, and I will tell you what that was now. It was $400,000 for hurt, distress and humiliation during her employment, $1.48 million for capital payment for loss of earnings, $220,000 for reimbursement for medical expenses and the like, $100,000 for past and future domestic assistance, and $245,000 in reimbursement.
Extraordinary. Caroline, what else happened in court today?
Well, it was a dramatic day in what was the third week of the defamation trial that Bruce Lehrmann is taking against Network 10 and its former star host Lisa Wilkinson. The court heard from a number of witnesses today, including the ex-boyfriend of Brittany Higgins, as well as a former colleague of hers who told the court that she had made disclosures to them that she had been raped by Bruce Lehrmann. The first was Ben Dillaway. He was in an on-off casual relationship with Ms. Higgins around the time of the alleged incident in 2019. He told the court that at first Ms. Higgins had told him that we brought the party back to Parliament House, but he thought that she was hiding something from him during that initial conversation. Later, he says that she disclosed to him that she had been raped and ended up sobbing in his arms. He says that he encouraged her to go and see a counsellor and get checked out for STDs in case she had contracted them, as well as going to a doctor, he said, would give her a record of that, but she never went through with that advice. The court also heard from a former colleague of Ms. Higgins, who had said that in the days following the alleged incident, she appeared to be very sad in the office. So she invited her on a walk, and it was during that conversation Ms. Higgins told her that something had happened, and she took from that there had been an assault. Mr. Lehrmann has always denied these allegations and said he had no sexual contact with Ms. Higgins. The trial continues.
Yeah, a lot of revelations every single day. Caroline Marcus, thank you so much for your updates. Now, joining me now is former Speaker of the House, Bronwyn Bishop, and commentator Jason Morrison. Welcome to you both. Look, just a few weeks ago, or a couple of months ago now, when the October 7 attacks first happened, we saw that there were hate preachers in Sydney and Melbourne who said highly inflammatory things, calls for jihad. We learned today in an exclusive story in The Australian that state and federal police plan on taking no action at all against them. They've dropped their investigation. They say that their comments, Bronwyn, don't meet the criminality threshold. The problem with this is if you're not going to... What is the point in having laws around hate speech if a preacher can literally stand up there and call for jihad and call for the death of Jews and the police say, oh, nothing to see here?
It's truly amazing. And what it does is it establishes the principle of just how much every group in this country is to tolerate. The level of tolerance has suddenly risen. You can't say it's okay for these people to slander, insult, incite hatred against Jews and not apply the same standard to Islamic people or to any other group of people in the community. That's what this decision says. If there's any movement that it's going to be, if you insult somebody for a gender issue, it's got to be the same standard. So give them an inch, they'll take a mile. And that's what happened in this thing. It should have been nipped in the bud. Immediately it occurred. Immediately there should have been arrests. And when those things were shouted out about gas the Jews, that's when the clampdown should have been.
Yeah.
You've got the Premier who comes out with, I'm strong and we won't have it, but you've got a police minister and a police force which absolutely does nothing to uphold the dignity and the civil and the criminal law as we understand it.
Oh, exactly.
So you just can't have the good cop, bad cop, pardon the pun in this instance. You can't have somebody saying, I'm a leader and I'm being strong, and then having all the people you're responsible for not carrying out the things that you say. And as for the Prime Minister, he has absolutely abrogated leadership on this issue, absolutely altogether.
Yeah, exactly. Jason, I don't understand why politicians announce these laws, such as song and dance, if they're never, ever applied.
Well, because it's feel-good stuff. It makes them feel like they're doing something and acting. And, Bronwyn's onto something here. When you've got a law and it doesn't apply to everyone all the time, then you sort of think the law's weak and you sort of ignore it. And that's what's happened. And, of course, this is the preferred victim group right now. And they've been able to exploit that because politicians at the moment are a bit gutless. And, I was a radio broadcaster once. I spent roughly 10 years in the courts up against a prominent Islamic figure who sued me for defamation and sued me for a whole lot of things, Mr. Trad. And I went after him on the air over some disgusting things he had said. Appalling. In fact, the judges found in my favour, and in the end, he was told to go away and the matter went to the High Court. But the point I'm getting at is the authorities should have, very early in the piece, absolutely smacked down on this one and said, I'm sorry, these are not acceptable things for you to say. And here's the point. We all know, you, me, Bronwyn, everyone watching this right now, I could say certain things on air and that'd be the end of my career. Yet these things are being said on the steps of the Opera House and they're just ignored and eyes are rolled and anyone who complains just needs to get a thicker skin. That's the game.
And not just on the steps of the Opera House, but they're online.
Really tragic.
They're on YouTube, they're on the internet. No one pulls them down from the internet either.
That's right.
They live on.
Bronwyn, we've seen the news today that there is going to be a cross-party delegation of politicians. Josh Burns is a Labor politician, Simon Birmingham, obviously from the coalition, who are finally going to travel to Israel. Still, Albanese and Penny Wong don't want to go.
But it just shows up the weakness of that leadership. I mean, he is Albo the Trot. He's not a leader's bootlace. And Penny Wong spends the time equivocating and trying to make some sort of even-handed approach between the Israelis who were raped, killed, brutalised, and trying to say there's something in there about Islamophobia. Not true. So she has lost respect, as far as I'm concerned. And as for the rest of them, they're so split when you've got people more concerned about how many Islamic voters they've got in their electorate as to what's right and wrong. Exactly. This is a very sick government, very sick indeed.
No, I agree. Politics and votes ahead of doing what's right.
Absolutely.
Jason, you're in Canberra this week. How do you think the Prime Minister ends the year? And also the news today that a fifth former detainee has now allegedly reoffended.
They just want this to go away, and the Christmas break will be the best thing for them, they think. But it won't be, because the longer this goes on, the longer Australians will start and just observe that this government has failed in its fundamental number one task, the protection of Australians. And it can get as clever as it wants about having no other choice but to do what they thought the High Court... there's adequate evidence and there's adequate legal argument out there that they didn't need to act with all, but they did. They failed, because I think deep down they thought they'd score a political hit out of this to be able to say, that guy, Dutton's the reason we're in this mess. It's his failure, it's his law, it's his everything. Whereas in fact Australians saw it for the BS that it is. And they can smell it from a mile away. So, you know, good luck hoping this one goes off into the fog, because Aussies will spend a lot of time over the next month, 2 months, watching, unfortunately, and I have to say it, more of these people find their way back into the hands of the police forces and know that there's still going to be a government that's sort of in denial that it could have done anything about it. It's really sad to watch. It was sad to sit in question time and to see them excuse themselves for this rather than take responsibility.
Bronwyn, obviously you've been involved in politics for a long time. Do you think this government can recover, or do you think the public has made up their minds about the Prime Minister?
Polling shows that the Labor vote is down to 29% today. He only ever got there in a third. What he's suffering now, I think, is terminal for him. Whether or not they try and change leaders, you've got people who are jockeying behind the scenes. I think that I've thought for a long time that Dutton can make it a one-term government and win the next election. I think the weakness of leadership is the thing. When Albanese was called a beta man, it's true. I mean, I sat in that chamber with him for 20 years and nobody ever said he was leadership material. And now we're seeing why. Yeah. So Albo the Trot likes fighting Tories, that's it. And yes, it's terminal.
Yeah. All right. We're out of time.
An observation, just quickly.
Yes, very quickly.
I was just going to say, just looking in the Parliament really quickly, I didn't see his normal big hitters come out in defence today. I didn't see them. They were slightly sitting there, arms crossed, looking across, quite dejected. Perhaps it's end-of-term blues, or perhaps they just have a sense.
Yeah, they definitely go into the holiday period on a low note. Bronwyn Bishop, thank you so much for joining me. Jason Morrison, we'll see you both next week. Now, still to come, a Holocaust survivor joins me to express his concern about where all these pro-Palestinian marches are heading. Stay tuned. Well, Eddie Boas was just a child when the Nazis invaded the Netherlands, where he was born, rounding up his family and sending them to the Westerbork and Bergen-Belsen concentration camps. Miraculously, Eddie and his family survived and then moved to Australia, a country they thought was safe for Jews. Eddie Boas joins me now. Thank you so much for your time today. So you were 3 when you went into the concentration camps, 5 when you came out. What do you remember from that time?
Well, I personally don't remember much at all. First of all, thanks for having me. My book's written about what my mother told me, and she was interviewed by the Spiegel Shoah Foundation. My brother suffered badly from the Holocaust. He had nightmares he was 4 years older than me. He remembers everything. So it took me 15 years to write my book.
And you survived because your father managed to steal extra food. Tell us about that.
My father was given a job because my mother pushed him into it. My father was given the job of picking up the dead bodies from the ground at Bergen-Belsen. And he looked after 2 horses, and he went around the camp in a cart, picked up the bodies out of the barracks and off the ground. But the Germans fed horses better than they did the Jews. So every once in a while he would go around the camp, and my brother would follow him, and my father would drop an apple or a carrot. And then my brother would just run to my mother, and she then, fed us with it, and also used it as a trade to give somebody an apple, to give shoes for me or a jumper for me, because there were no shops there.
Now, you moved to Australia. Obviously, it has been a safe place. What do you think about the anti-Semitism we're seeing at the moment? I think it's shocking. I'm absolutely disgusted with it. I've lived here for 70 years, came here as a 14-year-old. I had friends from Coogee, where we grew up. We arrived here with no money. We slept on the floor for the first few weeks, and my mother got a job at Coogee Bay as a cleaning lady. And there wasn't a lot of anti-Semitism I came across over the years in Australia till all this happened. And I think we have a weak government. I hope you don't mind me saying that. I say it every night.
And because you need a strong government to counter it. And I think having these marches all the time only adds more people to anti-Semitism.
And as we were just talking about, there are laws against hate speech, but the police aren't enforcing them. So they're letting the people who are inciting violence against Jews, they're just letting them off the hook.
Yeah, I'm a fan of the police. I think the police do a good job. I think it's the people who are leading the police. That what happened at the Opera House should have been stopped. But I think the police just didn't know, weren't given instructions. That's honestly my opinion. I'm a fan of the police. I've had a lot of policemen as friends, and they do a great job.
Where do you think this goes from here? Are you worried about the fact that this anti-Semitism seems to be getting worse by the day?
Absolutely. Look what happened at Bondi Westfield, the schoolgirls.
Exactly.
And unless the government steps in, I'm talking about federal government. I do believe Mr. Mintz does a good job. He's very strong, outspoken, but the federal government's got to step in.
And say that this conduct is not acceptable.
Yeah, and they should change the laws that these marches aren't allowed, because that only attracts kids and school kids. The Teachers Federation. I think it's a shocker.
It's one thing allowing freedom of speech and everyone has a right to protest, but not when it's calling for genocide or for Jews to no longer exist.
Well, I like to know how people can block the road and don't get fined. If I cross the road at an angle, it gets booked for jaywalking. How stupid is that?
Yeah. Eddie Boas, thank you very much for joining me. Just an honour to have you, and wonderful that you and your family survived. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you. Thank you so much for watching this week, and Peter Credlin is up in a moment. I'll see you back here Monday at 5 p.m.